In this brief overview, we'll be looking at the fracture tool and how we can use it to create destructible meshes. We'll be using some of these subtools to then help us create variety within our destructible mesh. We will then move on and add a particle system and a material to our destructible mesh to help sell the effect better. We'll then place the object within our level and give it a test run. So let's go ahead and get started. To access the fracture tool, we first need to double click on the static mesh that we're going to be fracturing. This will open up the static mesh editor. We can then choose Tool, Fracture Tool from the menu. The first parameter that we're going to be looking over, the number of chunks. This is very simple and pretty self-explanatory. The amount of chunks that you're allowed to have is between 1 chunk and 150 chunks. And the number of chunks that you're currently sitting on is displayed here by this middle number. I'm going to go ahead and select roughly 62 chunks. Now, something important to keep in mind is the less amount of chunks you have, the easier it is for your computer to process it in real time. The more chunks you have, the heavier it's going to be on your computer. We can go ahead and select 62 for the moment and click Generate. We can see this colorful wireframe display over the mesh, which is symbolizing where the mesh will be fractured. To view this a little bit better, we can come down to our viewing mode and check mark the Show Cut Solid. So just give a little bit better representation of what the chunks will look like when they're sliced. Next is the chunk shape. And within the chunk shape, we have our plane bias. These three fields here allow us to scale the chunks themselves on either the X, Y, or Z axis. So if I were to select the Z axis and change this from 1 to 10, we can then see that the chunks have been squashed on the Z axis. Now if I were to lower it below 1, say 0.4, we can see that the chunks have become elongated. The modified tool is extremely useful because it allows me to reorder the actual way that the chunks are slicing through the mesh, either as single chunks or change the overall pattern itself. You can either do this with the randomize button here or the move to faces, but I'm going to be using just randomize. Now the first thing that we need to do in order to get this tool to work properly is specify a maximum amount of movement allowed in a certain direction. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to set X to 1, set Y to 25, and Z to 50. Now that we have that specified, I'm going to deselect any chunks that I have selected and choose randomize. And you'll see that it randomizes the pattern. Now if we have a specific chunk here that we don't like, let's say this one, I can select it by left clicking and clicking randomize. I can randomize this until I feel that the chunk actually looks more like a chunk or that it's going to be slicing through the mesh properly. Next we have our chunk options. And by default, if there's nothing selected within your viewport here, then all these options are going to be grayed out in terms of their checkboxes. You can't click them. You're completely frozen. Reason is because you have to have a selection in order to specify its properties. So if we wanted to, we could manually left click on chunks. We can actually select multiple chunks by holding the control key and left clicking to add chunks to the selection. And now you'll notice that our options here are unfrozen. But for now, we're going to be using the chunk selection options down here that are specified by these buttons. So we have our grow selection, shrink selection, select top, select bottom, and our invert selection. The grow selection, pretty self-explanatory like most of the tools here. It's going to add on more chunks to the already selected chunks that you have. The shrink is going to take them away. Select top is going to select everything at the top of your mesh. Select bottom is going to select everything at the bottom of your mesh. And invert is going to take whatever you have selected, deselect it, and select everything else that's been unselected. I'm going to go ahead and choose select top. And we can see now that the top chunks have been selected. And I'm also going to choose select bottom. So now we have the bottom selected and the top selected. But I feel I need to add on some more chunks to make it more stable whenever we start breaking this apart. So my goal is to break the middle of it, but have the top and the bottom anchored to the floor and the ceiling. So to make that more believable, I'm going to grow my selection. And we can now see that the middle chunks here are our target chunks. Now what I'm going to do is, with these selected, I'm going to uncheck the checkbox for destroyable. So these selected chunks can no longer be destroyed, only the ones in the middle. I'm going to invert my selection and make sure that the destroyable checkbox is marked. I'm also going to invert my selection back again, and I want this to be my support chunks. So if we were to blow the center chunks out, this would still stay anchored to the wall, and this would still stay anchored to the floor, no matter what we did to it. We're not going to go too deep into the actual viewing or core options here, because of the fact that, for one, viewing is extremely self-explanatory. You have 3 different viewing types: view only, view all but, and view up to. These correspond with this slider here. Basically, view only is if you have a chunk selected and you have that mode on, it'll show just that chunk. If you have view all but, it'll show everything except what you have selected. And if you have view up to, you can slide this up and increase the chunks that it's showing here. So if you had 33, you could view all chunks up to 33. Also, these are your different viewing modes down here. So we can say show cuts, and if we deselect that, then we can see that the slices that are being made or being represented by the wireframe and the shaded overlay are now gone. If we turn that back on, we can say show cut solid, which is basically showing the shaded cage. If we turn that off, then we're back to just the default wireframe. Below that, we have our slice color mode, which this is actually extremely handy. So we can say random colors, which it's just showing a rainbow of colors. We have the support chunks. So it shows the support chunks in red. So we can see that the top and the bottom are our support chunks. We can do destroyable chunks. And now we see that the destroyable chunks are shown in red, and the support chunks are shown in blue. And we have the no physics chunks, which we have physics on everything, so none of it is highlighted red. Below that, we have our show core here, and the ability to add a core. And a core is basically a static mesh that's merged into your fractured model, and basically it just serves as a core. So as you break pieces off, you'll see the underlying model below it. And the way to add an actual core is to go to your content browser, select a static mesh, and then just click Add Core. So with all of that done, I'm going to drop down and actually say Slice. So it opened up the package dialog box here where it's giving me the package, the group, and the name of the mesh. And for now I'm going to keep the defaults, but you can send it anywhere just like anything else. You can scrub through your packages, or if you know the name of the package you want to send it to, you can always do that. You can make it inside of a fractured meshes group if you want to, and give it whatever name you want. But by default, it adds _fractured on the end of the original model's name. So if I click OK to accept it, it'll generate that model. If I view my content browser here, we can now see that we have the pillar, which is the one that we originally were editing, and the new fractured mesh. So let's go ahead and drop this into the scene and do some shooting. Now that I'm in, if I shoot the mesh, it should actually fracture, which it does. But you can see that there's several things that are wrong. For one, we're getting this checker pattern on the inside of the actual chunks. And two, when we shoot it, nothing really special happens. So to change this, we're going to first add a certain effect so that every time that a chunk breaks, some dust will fly out. Now I've simply grabbed this already created particle system here from the UDK game package, and I've just modified it basically by taking all the different size inputs and dividing them by half just to make it a little bit smaller. So if we click that, we open up our fractured mesh here. We can look over on the right where it says Fragment Destroy Effects. By default, it has 0 effects, so we need to click this little green plus sign here. We're going to click on the little green arrow here to use the selected object in the content browser. We can now see that the name is loaded up. So if we were to play this again, we can now see that dust actually emits whenever we're breaking the chunks. So that's a little bit more interesting. Now to fix that interior material, open up our fracture mesh here and drop down to the LOD info. And here inside the elements, you'll see that we have one material, which is our default material here that's been textured specifically for this asset. And we also have a material none, which is the interior material. So here I've just typed in floor on the UDK game package, and I selected this floor material and just made a copy of it. So if we take that and we click on the little green arrow here to use the selected from the content browser, you can now see that it's loaded up into that slot. So if we play it again, we can now see that the interior material is the floor material that we have assigned from the content browser. So that's the basics of fracturing a mesh, and you can get some really amazing results out of the fracture tool. So I highly recommend playing around with it and really trying to push the tool to its maximum capabilities.